The air in the apartment was the color of silence. It was a manufactured stillness, spun from recycled oxygen and filtered through 3 layers of antimicrobial mesh, chilled to a precise 17 degrees Celsius. It carried no dust, no memory, no life. It smelled of nothing, which the Regency Directorate called the scent of purity. Elian called it the scent of absence. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling chromo-glass wall, his reflection a pale watercolor wash against the sprawling, geometric perfection of Sector Gamma 7. Below, transport glides traced silent, luminous paths between monolithic towers of white plasteel and glass, their movements a synchronized ballet of absolute order. Everything was clean. Everything was calm. Everything was correct. His bondmate, Kale, was the architect of this particular brand of silence, not just in their shared living space, Unit 734 of the Apex Spire, but in his very presence. Kale was a Tier 1 administrator in the Department of Societal Harmony, a man sculpted from the Regency's most profound ideals. His jaw was a firm line of resolution, his eyes the cool grey of a winter morning, and his movements were economical, precise, devoid of any wasted energy. Even his scent, the marker of his alpha designation, was a study in control. It was not the raw, feral musk the old text described. It was a carefully cultivated aroma of clean linen, bergamot, and something metallic, like cool, polished steel. It was pleasant. It was reassuring. It was the scent of a locked door. Elian traced the faint outline of his own face in the glass. An Omega. The designation was a whisper in his biology, a series of genetic markers activated and managed since birth. His features were softer than Kale's, his frame more slender, his eyes a shade of blue that deepened or paled with barometric shifts in his own placid emotional climate. He was, by all Regency metrics, a perfect match for Kale. Their compatibility scores had been in the 99th percentile. The bonding ceremony had been a quiet, clinical affair in a white room, a chemical accelerant administered via a painless dermal patch. They had been declared harmonized, stable, a foundational unit for a stable society. And Elian was stable. He performed his duties with quiet grace. He managed the unit's environmental systems, curated their nutritional intake, and provided a serene presence for Kale upon his return from the Directorate. His days were measured by the soft chimes of the unit's scheduler, segmenting his existence into neat, digestible blocks: nutritional preparation, meditative practice, intellectual enrichment, readiness for pairing. There was no pain in this life. There was no chaos. And yet, some mornings, Elian would wake with a hollow ache deep in his chest, a phantom limb of an emotion he could not name. He would lie beside Kale's sleeping form, listening to the rhythmic, metered breaths, and feel an overwhelming sense of misplacement, as if he were a perfectly crafted key inserted into the wrong, albeit perfectly functional, lock. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass, the city lights below blurring into a river of sterile fire. The sensation was clean, smooth, without texture. Like his life, he was not unhappy. Unhappiness was a primitive, inefficient emotion, one the Regency had largely engineered out of the populace through genetic refinement and atmospheric stabilizers. He was simply empty. He was a beautiful, hollow vessel, waiting for something to fill him, and the carefully measured life Kyle provided flowed through him, without leaving a trace. Kyle would return in precisely 47 minutes. He would greet Elian with a light touch to the shoulder, a gesture of ownership that was both gentle and absolute. He would inquire about Elian's biometrics, which were monitored by the smart fabric of his clothes and the sensors in their bed. "Your serotonin levels were low this morning, Elian," he might say, his voice a calm, level baritone. "I've adjusted the nutrient dispenser for your evening meal. Stability must be maintained." Kale saw him as a beautiful, complex machine that required careful calibration. He appreciated Elian's aesthetic qualities, his compliance, his placid nature. He considered their bond a success, a testament to the Regency's wisdom. Love, in its messy, archaic form, was not part of the equation. Harmony was the goal. Predictability was the virtue. Their intimacy was a scheduled act, as clean and silent as everything else in their world. It was a transfer of energy, a biological imperative fulfilled with quiet efficiency. There was no surge of primal connection, no loss of self, no shattering climax that left them breathless and remade. It was a release, followed by the soft hum of the air recyclers and the cool touch of Kyle's hand on his back, a gesture that felt more like a final systems check than an act of affection. Elian closed his eyes, trying to summon the feeling the bonding ceremony was supposed to have imprinted on his soul. The texts spoke of a profound click, a sense of rightness that resonated in the very marrow of your bones, a scent that became your air, your home, your entire world. He could smell Kyle's scent on the collar of his own tunic, a faint, clean trace of bergamot and steel. It was familiar. It was Kyle, but it was not his world. It was just a room he was living in, a very clean, very quiet room. He had thought for years that this was all there was, that the poets and the ancient texts had simply been exaggerating, romanticizing a biological process. He had accepted the quiet hollowness as the price of peace, the nature of a civilized existence. He had learned to live with the ghost of a feeling, the echo of a song he'd never truly heard. He believed he was bonded. He believed he was stable. He was wrong. The foundation of his world was a sheet of glass, and a stone was about to be thrown. He just didn't know it yet. He turned from the window, the reflection of the perfect city dissolving, and went to prepare Kale's evening meal, his movements as silent and practiced as the glide trains below, each step a testament to a life lived in perfect, suffocating order. The invitation had arrived on a sliver of luminous data slate, its text appearing in calm, silver script. The dedication of the new Panopticon Tower was a significant event, a celebration of the Regency's ever-expanding reach of surveillance and therefore security. Kyle, as a Tier 1 administrator, was required to attend. As his bonded Omega, Elian's presence was also mandated. He stood beside Kale in the grand reception hall, a cavernous space of obsidian floors and soaring white arches. The air, thick with the mingled, controlled sense of the city's elite, felt heavy and cloying. It was a symphony of expensive, synthetic pheromones, citrus, rare florals, ozone, wood smoke, all muted, all polite. None of them touched the primal core of his being. They were perfumes, not presences. Elian kept his expression serene, his hands clasped loosely before him, a portrait of Omega grace. He was an accessory to Kale's power, a living symbol of his stability and good standing. He could feel the gazes of other alphas and omegas, assessing, cataloging. His tunic was the prescribed shade of ivory. His hair was perfectly coiffed. His biometrics, he knew, were broadcasting a state of perfect calm. It was a lie, of course, a well-practiced, socially acceptable lie. Inside, the hollow ache was a low, persistent hum, a dissonance in the otherwise perfect harmony of the evening. Kyle was speaking with another administrator, his voice a low murmur of facts and figures. Elian was a silent partner to the conversation, nodding when appropriate, his gaze distant. He focused on the play of light across a massive, slow-turning kinetic sculpture that hung from the ceiling, its crystalline arms catching and refracting the hall's cold, white light. The hum of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the soft electronic chimes that announced the arrival of dignitaries, it all blurred into a single, monotonous drone. He felt disconnected, a ghost observing a party of other ghosts. He was not here. Not really. He was floating somewhere above it all, tethered to Kyle by a fragile, invisible string. A leash. The word surfaced, unbidden and sharp, and he quickly suppressed it. Such thoughts were destabilizing, inefficient. Kyle would disapprove. The sculpture continued its slow, hypnotic turn. The light fractured. The world held its breath. Then it happened. A tremor of discordance rippled through the hall. Not a sound at first, but a shift in the atmosphere. A collective intake of breath, a sudden tension that tightened the air. The polite drone of conversation faltered. Heads turned toward the main entrance, a massive set of steel doors. The soft chimes were replaced by the harsh, metallic clang of security bolts. A disturbance, unscheduled, unsanctioned. Red lights began to pulse along the cornices of the ceiling, casting the white arches in a bloody, alarming glow. Kale's hand immediately found Elian's arm, his grip firm, proprietary. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice losing none of its calm authority. A minor security matter. But Elian wasn't looking at Kale. He was looking at the doors, a strange, inexplicable pull drawing his attention. The doors hissed open, not with the smooth grace of a formal arrival, but with a jarring, forced urgency. Two enforcers in black, carapace-like armor marched in, their plasma rifles held at the ready. Between them, shackled at the wrists and ankles, with glowing energy cuffs, was a man. He was nothing like the polished alphas in the hall. He was tall and lean, built with a wiry strength that was apparent even in his constrained state. His clothes were torn and stained with dirt and something dark that looked like dried blood. His dark hair was matted, falling across a face that was all sharp angles and stark planes, bruised and cut, but set in a mask of defiant fury. His eyes, a startling, intense shade of amber, scanned the crowd with raw, undisguised contempt. He was a creature of the wild, a thing of chaos and violence dragged into this sterile sanctuary of order. A dissident, a feral, a failure of the system. He was a problem to be contained and neutralized. And then the air shifted again. The wind from the forced open doors carried his scent across the hall. It was not a perfume. It was a presence. It was a storm. It hit Elian like a physical blow, a wave of pure, undiluted alpha that slammed into his senses and shattered the placid surface of his world. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, the petrichor rising from parched earth after a sudden downpour. It was the raw, primal scent of crushed pine needles, of distant wood smoke, of something deeply, unapologetically animal. It was a scent that spoke of open skies and untamed wilderness, of struggle and survival and freedom. It was everything this room was not. Everything he was not. And it called to something deep within him, a sleeping, ancient part of his biology that he never knew existed. His knees went weak. The air rushed from his lungs in a silent gasp. The room tilted. the faces of the guests blurring into indistinct smears of color. The polite, synthetic scents of the party were obliterated, burned away by this one, singular, overwhelming truth. This was Alpha, not the managed, civilized version Kale represented, but the real, elemental force of it. Kale's scent, the clean, sterile aroma of bergamot and steel that had defined Elian's world, vanished. It was still there, physically, but his senses no longer registered it. It was a whisper drowned out by a thunderclap. In that moment, Kale's scent meant nothing. The only thing that existed was the storm. The prisoner's amber eyes swept the room, and for a fraction of a second, they met Elian's. The world stopped. The noise, the lights, the panic, it all fell away. In that gaze, he saw not a feral beast, but a fierce, burning intelligence, a soul trapped in a cage. And he felt a flicker of recognition, a sense of impossible, terrifying familiarity. It was the click, the profound, bone-deep click the old texts had described. A key finding its lock. Kale's grip on his arm tightened, pulling him back from the precipice. "Elian, compose yourself." His voice was a cold anchor in the swirling chaos of Elian's senses. But it was too late. The stone had been thrown. The glass was shattered. The world Elian had known was gone, and in its place was the terrifying, exhilarating scent of a coming storm. He was not bonded. He had never been bonded. He had been asleep, and he was, finally, terrifyingly awake. The prisoner was dragged away, his magnetic shackles scraping against the obsidian floor, the sound a raw scream in the returning silence. The great steel doors slid shut, sealing the chaos out, or perhaps sealing it in. The red lights ceased their frantic pulsing, replaced once more by the cold, impartial white. An announcement, spoken by a calm, disembodied voice, echoed through the hall, assuring the guests that the threat had been neutralized and that the celebration of progress would continue momentarily. The murmur of the crowd slowly returned, voices edged with a nervous excitement, the incident already being processed into a thrilling anecdote. But for Elian, the world refused to right itself. He stood frozen, Kale's hand a heavy weight on his arm, his body trembling with the aftershocks of a cataclysm only he had felt. The air, scrubbed clean again by the filtration systems, felt suffocating. He could still smell it. The ghost of that scent, ozone and wet earth and wildness, clung to the inside of his lungs, a phantom presence that made everything else seem faded and unreal. He took a shallow, shaky breath, and the sterile scent of Kale's cologne felt like an insult, a lie his body now refused to accept. "Your vitals are erratic," Kyle stated, his voice low and devoid of alarm. It was an observation, not a question. He tilted his head, his grey eyes performing a clinical scan of Elian's face. "Your pupils are dilated. Your heart rate is elevated by 22%. A predictable response to the disruption. Predictable." The word was a slap. There was nothing predictable about the tectonic shift that had just occurred in Elian's soul. He felt as if his very DNA had been rewritten, the code of his existence scrambled by a single, devastating sensory input. He wanted to scream, to weep, to claw at his chest where the hollow ache had been replaced by a violent, frantic fluttering. But he did none of those things. Years of conditioning, of training in the art of placid compliance, held him in place. He smoothed, a non-existent crease in his tunic, his fingers clumsy. "I am fine," he managed, his voice a strained whisper. "Just startled. Kyle's expression did not change. It was the calm, patient look of a scientist observing a data anomaly. The atmospheric stabilizers will recalibrate. Your equilibrium will be restored. Compliance ensures comfort. He released Elian's arm, the gesture signaling the end of the discussion. The incident was over. It was to be forgotten. But Elian could not forget. The scent was branded on his memory, a scar on his perception. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Elian moved through the motions, a perfect automaton of social grace. He smiled. He nodded. He sipped nutrient-rich water from a crystal flute. But he was not there. He was trapped in the echo of that moment, replaying the prisoner's defiant gaze, inhaling the ghost of his scent. He kept glancing at the great steel doors, half hoping, half fearing they would burst open again. He felt a desperate, insane urge to know who that man was. Where had he come from? What had he done to warrant such a dramatic capture? And what was this terrifying connection that hummed between them? A high-frequency vibration that only he could feel. Later, back in the silent, sterile perfection of their apartment, Kale stood before the dispensary unit, programming Elian's sleep cycle nutrients. "I have increased the dosage of the serotonin balancer," he announced, his back to Elian, "and added a mild neural sedative. The evening's events have clearly caused a significant imbalance. We must correct it before it compromises your stability." Compromises his stability. The phrase echoed in the quiet room. Kyle believed his distress was a malfunction, a bug in his programming. He saw it as a problem to be solved with chemicals and control. He could not possibly comprehend that Elian's imbalance was, in fact, the first moment of true balance he had ever experienced, that his previous stability had been the actual sickness. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamt in scent. He was lost in a vast, dark forest, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. He was running, though from what? He did not know. Then, through the trees, he smelled it, the scent of ozone and pine. It was a beacon, a promise. He followed it, his feet bare on the cold earth, branches tearing at his clothes. The scent grew stronger, pulling him onward, a magnetic force he was powerless to resist. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling of his life. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was dark, silent, except for the soft hum of the recycler. The air was clean, too clean. But the phantom scent from the dream lingered, a tantalizing memory that made his entire body ache with a nameless longing. He turned his head on the pillow. Kale was asleep beside him, his breathing a perfect, steady rhythm. The scent of bergamot and steel was faint in the chilled air. Elian inhaled deeply, searching for the old comfort, the familiar sense of order. He found nothing. The scent that had once defined his world was now just a chemical compound, a fragrance with no meaning. It had no hold on him. It was the scent of a stranger. He lay awake for the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, a prisoner in his own perfect life. A single, terrifying thought repeated itself, over and over, a mantra of newfound truth. I am not his. The realization was not a comfort. It was a condemnation. If he was not Kale's, in a world built on such certainties, then what was he? Who was he? The answer was a terrifying void, and somewhere, deep within the secure confines of a Regency detention block, the man who was the cause of it all was breathing, his own scent a silent rebellion in a world that demanded conformity. Days bled into one another. each a perfect replica of the last, yet fundamentally altered. On the surface, nothing in Unit 734 had changed. The air was still 17 degrees Celsius. The lights still brightened and dimmed on their circadian schedule. Kyle still left at 700 and returned at 1900, his movements governed by an unwavering internal clock. But a fissure had cracked the foundation of Elian's reality, and with each passing hour, it grew wider. The phantom scent haunted him, an intermittent ghost that would ambush his senses at unexpected moments. He would be arranging nutrient paste into a pleasing geometric shape on a plate, and suddenly the air would thicken with the smell of a distant storm. He would be meditating, trying to find the silent center of his mind, and the raw scent of pine and wild earth would fill his head, shattering his focus. He began to live in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, caught between two worlds, the sterile, visible reality of his life with Kale and the vibrant, sensory world that the prisoner had unlocked within him. He was losing weight. Dark circles, like faint bruises, appeared beneath his eyes. The smart fabric of his clothes dutifully reported these deviations to Kale. "Your REM cycle is disrupted," Kyle noted one evening, reviewing the data on his personal slate. He didn't look at Elian, his focus entirely on the glowing screen. "And your cortisol levels are consistently elevated. The sedatives are not performing to specification." He paused, his finger tracing a graph on the slate. "I've scheduled a diagnostic for you at the wellness center tomorrow. They will need to recalibrate your neurochemical profile." A diagnostic. A recalibration. Elian felt a surge of cold panic. They would drug him, adjust him, smooth over the beautiful, terrible chaos that had woken up inside him. They would try to make him forget the scent. They would try to put him back to sleep. "That isn't necessary," Elian said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I feel better today. The imbalance is resolving itself." It was the first time he had actively lied to Kale, a conscious, deliberate deception. The words felt strange and powerful in his mouth. Kale finally looked up, his grey eyes holding Elian's for a long moment. He was searching for the familiar placidity, the easy compliance. Elian held his gaze, forcing his expression to remain serene, a perfect mask of his former self. "Your biometrics contradict your assertion," Kyle said flatly. "However, self-reporting is a data point. I will postpone the diagnostic for 48 hours. If your metrics do not show significant improvement by then, the appointment will proceed. Stability is paramount." He turned his attention back to the slate. The conversation closed. Elian had bought himself 2 days. 2 days to do what? He didn't know. He only knew he couldn't let them erase this. He couldn't let them erase him. The need to know became an obsession, a fever in his blood. Who was the prisoner? Where was he being held? He began to watch Kale, not as a mate, but as a source of information. He observed the files Kale brought home on his slate, catching glimpses of classified headings: dissident protocol, subversive containment, repatterning schedule. He listened to Kyle's hushed comm calls, piecing together fragments of information about a recent surge in feral activity outside the city walls and the capture of a high-value target, a leader of a rebel faction known only as Reese. Reese. The name resonated in his chest, a deep, resonant chord. Was that him? Was that the man with the amber eyes and the scent of the storm? He had to know. Kale's position at the Directorate gave him access to the Panopticon systems, the very heart of the Regency's surveillance network. His private terminal in their study was a gateway to that power. It was, of course, biometrically sealed, locked to Kyle's retinal scan and palm print, an insurmountable wall, but every system had a protocol. Every fortress had a maintenance schedule. His opportunity came, as it often did, cloaked in the mundane. Kale was summoned to an emergency overnight session at the Directorate. A rare deviation from his schedule, but one Elian had learned to anticipate by observing the subtle tells, the tightening of Kyle's jaw, the slight increase in his comm call frequency. "I will be returning at 600, Kyle stated as he adjusted the collar of his uniform. "Ensure the unit remains on secure footing. Your sedatives are on the nightstand." He paused at the door, his hand resting on the lock panel. He looked back at Elian, a flicker of something unreadable in his cool, grey eyes. For a moment, Elian thought he saw suspicion, but then it was gone, replaced by the usual placid authority. "Rest, Elian. Your distress is, inefficient." The door hissed shut, and he was alone. The silence that followed was different. It was not the empty silence of absence. It was the charged silence of opportunity. The sedative tablets sat untouched on the nightstand, two small white discs of forgetting. He swept them into his palm and flushed them down the waste reclamation unit. He walked into the study. The room was Kyle's sanctuary, even more sterile and ordered than the rest of the apartment. His terminal sat on a black desk, its screen dark, a sleeping obsidian eye. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. This was a violation, an act of rebellion that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He ran his fingers along the edge of the desk. He had no way past the biometric lock. It was hopeless. He was about to turn away when he remembered something, a detail from one of Kale's muttered comm calls. A system-wide diagnostic was scheduled for the entire Apex Spire network tonight, between Oro 200 and Zeo 215, a 15-minute window where security protocols were temporarily lowered to allow maintenance subroutines to run. During that window, a Tier 1 administrator could access any terminal in the Spire using a verbal override code. A code Kale had spoken aloud just 2 nights ago, thinking he was alone. Elian looked at the chrono display on the wall. 00158. He had 2 minutes. He sat in Kyle's chair. It was cold and unyielding, molded to the precise contours of Kyle's body, not his. He felt like an imposter, a child playing in his father's office. He placed his hands on the cool surface of the desk, his breathing shallow. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime. At precisely 0200, the lights in the apartment flickered once, and a soft tone chimed, signaling the start of the diagnostic window. A small green light began to pulse on the terminal. Now. He leaned forward, his voice a dry whisper, and spoke the code he had memorized, the string of alphanumeric nonsense that was the key to everything. Override, Kilo Delta 77 Gamma. Authorize. The terminal screen flickered to life. A prompt appeared. Enter query. His fingers trembled as he typed the name. RHYS. He hit enter. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second, then a file bloomed onto the screen. And there he was. It was a mugshot, stark and clinical. The bruising was more pronounced, a cut on his lips swollen and dark. But the eyes were the same. Fierce, unbroken, amber fire. The file was dense with technical jargon. Subject, Reese. Designation, Alpha, unregistered. Origin, the outer zones. Affiliation, Marinus Resistance Cell, leader. There was a list of charges. Insurrection, sabotage of Regency infrastructure, assault on enforcement officers, and then a section titled Biological Profile. Elian's breath caught in his throat. He scrolled down, his eyes scanning lines of genetic data, hormone levels, pheromonal output readings. The numbers were off the charts, orders of magnitude higher than any registered alpha in the Regency database. The report called his scent profile a biohazard, a destabilizing agent capable of inducing instinctual reversion in compliant Omega populations. Instinctual reversion, the clinical term for what had happened to him. He was not malfunctioning. He was reverting to what he was always meant to be. He scrolled further, his heart a frantic drum. Current status contained. Panopticon Tower, Sublevel 12, Medical Bay 3. Subject is undergoing preliminary stages of repatterning protocol. Repatterning, the Regency's term for breaking a person's mind and rebuilding it into something compliant. They were going to erase him. They were going to destroy that fierce, wild spirit and replace it with a blank, placid obedience. They were going to take the storm and turn it into a sterile breeze, a surge of protective fury so powerful it left him breathless, washed through Elian. It was an emotion he had never felt before, primal, possessive, absolute, mine. The word was not a thought, it was a visceral truth that resonated from the core of his being. He had to stop them. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to. He scanned the file for more information. Medical Bay 3. It was a high-security ward, but Omegas with bonded Tier 1 mates were sometimes granted access for companionship therapy, a method of calming agitated subjects. It was a long shot, a loophole so small he could barely see it. But it was there. His eyes fell on the last entry in the log, timed just an hour ago. Subject has entered a state of extreme agitation, vitals unstable. Repatterning has been temporarily suspended, sedation ineffective. A cold, terrifying thought bloomed in his mind. Was Reese agitated because of him? Could this connection, this impossible bond, flow both ways? Could he feel Elian's panic, his desperation across the city? The diagnostic window was closing. The terminal chimed a 1-minute warning. Elian's mind raced. He memorized the layout of Sub-Level 12, the shift schedules of the medical staff, the protocols for Omega visitation. He downloaded a schematic of the medical bay to a hidden partition on his personal data slate, encrypting it with a simple code he hoped Kyle's logic would overlook. Just as the final second ticked away, he cleared the screen, blanking the search history. The terminal went dark. The green light vanished. The lights in the apartment flickered again, the diagnostic complete. It was as if nothing had happened, but everything had. He sat in the dark, the scent of Kale's sterile office thick around him. But all he could smell was ozone and pine, a promise and a warning. He was no longer just a victim of this awakening. He was now a conspirator. The decision settled in his bones, not as a choice, but as an inevitability. It was a cold, hard certainty that displaced the frantic panic of the night before. He was going to free Reese. The thought was no longer insane. It was simply the next logical step in a world that had ceased to make sense. The hollow ache in his chest was gone, filled now with a quiet, dangerous purpose. He felt solid, real. For the first time in his life, he was a cause, not an effect. He began to move through his day with a new, chilling precision. He was no longer the placid, slightly melancholic Omega Kale knew. He was a reflection of him, a perfect mirror of Kale's own calculated efficiency. He became the role he had been playing his entire life. But now, it was a performance, a weapon. When Kale returned that morning, Elian greeted him with a serene smile. He had taken a mild stimulant from the unit's medical kit, just enough to counteract the sleepless night and present a facade of refreshed vitality. He had even used a dab of Kale's own scent neutralizer on his pulse points, a subtle act of olfactory camouflage. "You seem improved," Kyle observed, his gaze analytical. "Your biometrics are closer to baseline." "I rested well," Elian replied, his voice smooth as silk. "You were right. The distress was temporary." He saw the flicker of satisfaction in Kyle's eyes. His data had been proven correct. The anomaly was resolving itself. He had successfully recalibrated his machine. The lie was a success, and Elian felt a sliver of dark, triumphant pleasure. He spent the day in a state of hyper-awareness, his mind a whirlwind of planning behind a mask of calm. He studied the schematics he had downloaded, memorizing the labyrinthine corridors of the panopticon's sub-levels. He cross-referenced the medical staff schedules with Kyle's own directorate rota, searching for an intersection, a window of opportunity. It was there, a slim 90-minute gap in 3 days' time, a period when Kyle would be in a secured, off-network budget meeting and the head of the medical bay, a stern alpha named Administrator Thorne, would be off shift. The ward would be under the supervision of a junior medic, a beta who, according to his file, had recently been reprimanded for protocol laxity. It was a fragile chance, a plan built on a scaffold of maybes, but it was all he had. To get there, he needed a reason, a legitimate, Kale-approved reason to be at the Panopticon's wellness center. He looked at the postponed diagnostic appointment on his slate. The solution was simple. He would fail. For the next 2 days, Elian engaged in subtle, deliberate self-sabotage. He restricted his own nutrient intake, carefully skirting the line of malnutrition. He interrupted his sleep cycles, waking himself at precise intervals to ensure his cortisol levels remained elevated. He used his meditative practice not to calm his mind, but to focus on the scent, the memory of Reese, intentionally spiking his heart rate and galvanic skin response. His body became his instrument, and he played it with a virtuoso's skill. He watched with a detached fascination as his biometrics painted a picture of steady decline on Kyle's nightly reports. Kyle's brow furrowed. His calm was pricked with the faintest hint of irritation. His machine was not responding to calibration. "This is illogical," Kale murmured, staring at the data. "The sedatives, the nutrient balances. There should be a corresponding improvement." Elian lowered his gaze, affecting a look of fragile confusion. "I don't understand it either," he whispered. "I try to be calm. I try to be stable. But there is a noise inside me." The description was perfect. It was a term Kale, the man of order, would understand. A system malfunction. A signal degradation. "The diagnostic is no longer optional," Kyle declared, his voice firm. He tapped a few commands into his slate. "I have rescheduled it for tomorrow at 1400. I will escort you myself. They will get to the root of this dissonance." Elian inclined his head in silent, grateful acceptance. "Thank you, Kale." Inside, his heart beat a steady, triumphant rhythm. The first phase of his plan was complete. He had his entry ticket. The next day, as he dressed in the pale grey tunic required for medical appointments, a strange sense of calm descended upon him. This was it. There was no turning back. He stood before the mirror, looking at his reflection. He looked pale, fragile, his eyes large in his thinned face. He looked like a victim. It was the perfect disguise. As he was about to turn away, he noticed it, a small, almost imperceptible detail he had overlooked. On the vanity, next to Kyle's array of scent neutralizers and pheromone regulators, was a small, elegant atomizer filled with a clear liquid. Bond reinforcement spray, the label read, for use in periods of omega instability or environmental stress. He had never seen Kyle use it. He had never needed to. Elian was the model of compliance. He picked it up. It felt cool and heavy in his hand, a chemical leash, an olfactory chain. He thought of Reese's scent, so powerful it had rewritten his biology. And he looked at this, the Regency's pathetic, synthetic imitation. A cold, audacious idea sparked in his mind. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions, but if it worked, he slipped the atomizer into a hidden pocket inside his tunic. Kyle escorted him to the panopticon, his presence a silent, oppressive weight at Elian's side. They moved through security checkpoints, Kyle's Tier 1 clearance parting the way like a blade. The wellness center was as sterile and white as the rest of the Regency, but here the silence was punctuated by the soft beeps and hums of medical equipment. A beta nurse greeted them, her smile practiced and impersonal. "Administrator Kale, the diagnostic suite is ready for your Omega." Kale nodded. "Proceed. I must attend a meeting. I will return to collect him at 15:30. Send me the preliminary report as soon as it is available." He turned to Elian, his hand resting on his shoulder for a moment. The touch was meant to be reassuring. It felt like a brand. "Be compliant, Elian. Let them help you." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the white corridor. Elian was alone with the nurse. He took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils. Now, the performance began. "Before we begin," he said, his voice soft and trembling slightly. "Administrator Kyle. He mentioned something about companionship therapy." The nurse consulted her slate. "That is not on your schedule for today. Your appointment is for a neurochemical diagnostic." "I know," Elian whispered, looking down at his hands. "But the dissonance. It's worse when I'm alone." Kale thought. He thought the proximity of a calmer alpha presence might help stabilize my readings for a more accurate diagnostic. "There is a subject, a new one, in Medical Bay 3. He thought perhaps—" He let the sentence hang, his expression a carefully crafted mask of vulnerable hope. The nurse looked hesitant. It was a breach of protocol, but the request came with the weight of a Tier 1 administrator's name. And looking at the pale, trembling Omega before her, she saw not a conspirator, but a fragile creature on the verge of collapse. A little companionship therapy couldn't hurt. It might even help. "Sub-level 12 is a restricted area," she said, but her tone was softening. "But the subject in Bay 3 is sedated and secure. And if Administrator Kale suggested it, very well. 10 minutes, no more. It will give the diagnostic suite time to fully sterilize." She led him to a secure lift. As the doors slid shut, plunging them down into the bowels of the panopticon, Elian's hand tightened around the cold atomizer in his pocket. He was a breath away from the storm. Sub-level 12 was colder than the upper floors, the air humming with the low thrum of heavy machinery. The corridor was narrow, lined with reinforced steel doors, each with a small, thick glass viewport. The nurse stopped before one marked MB3. "He is heavily restrained," she said, her voice a low murmur, "and sedated. Do not approach the containment field. Just sit. The ambient alpha pheromones should have a calming effect. She keyed a code into the panel beside the door. It slid open with a heavy hiss. 10 minutes, she repeated, before turning and walking back toward the lift, her footsteps receding into the humming silence. Elian stepped inside. The room was small, circular, and bathed in a dim blue light. The walls were padded. In the center of the room, on a raised plinth, was a containment bed. And on the bed lay Rhys. He was stripped to the waist, his torso a roadmap of scars, new and old. His wrists and ankles were locked in heavy magnetic clamps. A transparent energy field, a faint, shimmering curtain, surrounded the plinth. He was not asleep. His amber eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but they were unfocused, glazed with the heavy sedatives they had pumped into him. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. Even in this state, he radiated a furious energy, a power that the drugs could dull, but not extinguish. And the scent. Oh, the scent. Here, in this confined space, it was overwhelming. It was the storm, the wild earth, the pine forest, all of it, potent and undiluted. It saturated the air, a thick, intoxicating presence that made Elian's head spin. The sedatives were clearly not working as intended. They had dampened Rhys's consciousness, but they couldn't suppress the sheer force of his biology. Elian took a step closer, his heart aching with a feeling so fierce it was almost pain. He was so close. He could see the faint pulse beating in Rhys's throat, the dark stubble on his jaw. He wanted to reach through the shimmering field, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin. He was a fool, a romantic, naive fool. What had he hoped to accomplish by coming here? To see him one last time before they broke him, to say goodbye to a man he didn't even know. The futility of his plan crashed down on him. He couldn't free him. He was just an Omega, a creature bred for compliance, standing in a high-security prison. He sank onto a small metal stool near the door, a wave of despair washing over him. He had failed before he had even begun. He sat there for a long minute, breathing in the scent that was both his undoing and his salvation. It was agonizing. The proximity was a torment. Then something shifted. Rhys's breathing pattern changed, becoming slightly faster. His head turned on the pillow, a slow, sluggish movement, as if fighting against immense weight. His unfocused amber eyes moved, scanning the small room, and then they found Elian. They locked on him. The glazed look receded, replaced by a spark of sharp, sudden clarity. He saw him. He knew him. A low sound rumbled in Rhys's chest, not a word, but a deep, guttural growl of recognition. It vibrated through the floor, through the very air, and straight into Elian's bones. He could feel it. This connection was real. It was two-sided. Rhys's gaze held his, intense and questioning. He was trapped, drugged, but he was present. And in his eyes, Elian saw not just recognition, but a plea, a silent, desperate command. Run. The despair vanished, burned away by a fresh surge of adrenaline. No, he would not run. He would not leave him here. He had to do something. Now. He remembered the atomizer in his pocket. The gamble. He stood up, his movements quick and decisive. He walked to the environmental control panel on the wall, a small screen displaying the room's atmospheric composition. It showed the air was being constantly scrubbed, filtered to contain Rhys's potent pheromones. Elian's fingers flew across the screen. He couldn't disable the main filtration, but he could override the local distribution. He rerouted the room's air circulation, directing the primary outflow vent not into the main scrubbers, but into the general ventilation system of sub-level 12. A small, insignificant change that no one would notice for hours. Then he took out the atomizer. Bond, reinforcement spray. A synthetic, concentrated dose of Kale's pheromonal signature. He looked at Reese, whose eyes were wide now, tracking his every move with a fierce, confused intensity. Elian held his gaze, trying to project all of his intent, his promise, in a single look. I will come back for you. He pointed the atomizer at the intake vent for the room's air system, and he sprayed. He emptied the entire container, the fine mist of synthetic bergamot and steel sucked into the vent, a chemical lye sent out into the station's arteries. A few minutes from now, the sensitive olfactory sensors in the security system would register a massive, anomalous spike of a Tier 1 administrator's pheromones in a restricted area where none should be. It would trigger alarms. It would cause confusion. It would create a diversion, a chaos of scent. As the last of the spray hissed into the vent, he heard footsteps in the corridor. The nurse. His 10 minutes were up. He slipped the empty atomizer back into his pocket and gave Reese one last, fleeting look. Reese's eyes were burning with a wild, dawning understanding. He knew. The door hissed open. "Time's up," the nurse said, her voice cheerful. "Feeling calmer?" Elian turned, his face a perfect mask of placid serenity. "Yes," he said, his voice soft and clear. "Much calmer." He walked out of the room, leaving the scent of a gathering storm and the chemical ghost of a lie to collide behind him. The game had begun. The chaos started subtly, a soft, insistent chime from the nurse's comlink as she escorted him back to the lift. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That's odd," she murmured. "Olfactory sensors on this level are reporting a containment breach. Pheromonal signature of Administrator Kale?" She looked at Elian, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "He's in a meeting on the 90th floor." Elian kept his expression placid, a mask of innocent bewilderment. "Perhaps the sensors are malfunctioning," he suggested softly. The lift doors opened, and he stepped out into the main corridor of the wellness center, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get out of here before Kyle was alerted, before the illogical data points connected into a picture of his treason. The nurse was distracted, speaking in low, urgent tones into her comm. "Negative. I have the Omega with me. Administrator Kale is not on this level. Run a diagnostic on the sensors." It was the opening he needed. While her back was turned, he slipped away, melting into the quiet foot traffic of the center. He didn't run. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace, a pale ghost in a white world, his every movement calculated not to draw attention. He was a fish swimming with the current, using the system's own predictable flow to become invisible. He could feel the atmosphere of the panopticon begin to shift. More comm chatter, the quick, sharp steps of enforcers. A low-level alert began to pulse through the building's internal systems, a subliminal vibration he could feel in the soles of his shoes. He had thrown a wrench into the great, sterile machine, and its gears were beginning to grind. His destination was not the exit. He knew Kale would have been alerted by now, and would be on his way, sealing the building's egress points. To escape the panopticon was impossible, but he didn't need to escape it. He just needed to navigate it. He made his way to the Directorate Archives on the 75th floor. It was a place of silence and data, manned by low-level beta functionaries who rarely looked up from their screens. It was also, as he had learned from Kale's files, one of the few areas with its own independent, shielded power grid and network access, a failsafe to protect the Regency's records. He slipped into an empty data carrel, the privacy screens humming to life around him. He was hidden for now. He pulled his personal slate from his tunic, his fingers flying across its surface. He had bought himself time, but it was a currency he was spending with every passing second. The diversion on sub-level 12 would not last forever. They would eventually trace the anomaly to the empty atomizer, find his fingerprints, and the search would become a hunt. He had to escalate the chaos. He had to turn his small act of sabotage into a system-wide crisis. Accessing the Panopticon's network from a personal slate was impossible. But he wasn't trying to get in. He was trying to crash it. He opened the schematic he had downloaded, the layout of Medical Bay 3. It was more than just a floor plan. It contained embedded data on the containment field, the life support systems, the power conduits. It was a user's manual for Reese's prison, and every system has an exploit. He found it in the code for the energy field, a fail-safe protocol designed to prevent a catastrophic power overload. If the field's energy input spiked beyond a certain threshold, the system would attempt an emergency shutdown and reboot. During the reboot cycle, which lasted for 7 seconds, the field would drop completely. It was a safety measure. He was about to use it as a weapon. The problem was triggering the spike. He couldn't do it from here, but he could send a message to someone who could. The file on Reese had mentioned his affiliation, the Marinus Resistance Cell. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer, but he had to believe they were listening. Using an old, encrypted back-channel protocol he had once seen Kale use to access non-Regency networks, he composed a message. It was not words, it was pure data, a compressed file containing the schematic of Medical Bay 3, the specific line of code for the energy field exploit, and a single repeating timestamp, tomorrow at 0300. He attached a header, a simple string of text he prayed would mean something to them, a phrase he had overheard in Kale's frantic comm calls about the resistance. The tide is turning. He hit send. The data packet shot out into the ether, a tiny, anonymous whisper in a hurricane of information. He had no way of knowing if it would reach its destination. He had no way of knowing if anyone was even there to receive it. He had cast his message in a bottle into a digital ocean. All he could do now was wait and survive. A voice, calm and authoritative, suddenly echoed from the carrel's small speaker. Elian, Kyle. He had found him, not physically, but through the network. He had traced his slate's signal. Elian's blood ran cold. He said nothing. "I know you can hear me, Elian," the voice continued, still perfectly level, yet underscored with a chilling tension. "This behavior is profoundly irrational. Your actions are compromising not only your own stability, but the security of this facility. You have been misled. Your senses are malfunctioning. The feral's pheromonal signature is a biological weapon. It has infected you. Infected. Like he was a disease. Return to the wellness center," Kyle commanded. "Allow them to treat you. We can reverse the damage. We can restore you to baseline. This is your only logical path." Logical. Kale's entire world was built on logic. He could not comprehend an action born of anything else. He could not understand that Elian was not broken, but remade. That this was not an infection, but a cure. Elian looked at the carrel's privacy screen. He could see Kyle's silhouette approaching, flanked by two enforcers. He was out of time. He had one last card to play. He activated his slate's microphone. "Kale," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Do you know why the Marinus Resistance calls themselves that?" There was a pause. "The query is irrelevant," Kale said, his voice closer now. He was just outside the carol. "They are named for the ancient mariner's star," Elian continued, speaking quickly, the words flowing from a place of newfound strength. "The one constant point of light in the sky that sailors use to navigate. They believe everyone has a fixed point, a true north, a person that guides them home." He took a deep breath. "I have found my true north, Kale, and it is not you." He terminated the connection, wiped his slate clean with a final command, and stood up just as Kale and the enforcers entered the carol. Kale's face was a mask of cold fury, the first genuine emotion Elian had ever seen on him. It was not the anger of a betrayed lover. It was the anger of a scientist whose experiment had failed, whose data had become corrupted. "You will be contained," Kale said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will be repaired." The enforcers grabbed his arms, their grips like iron vices. As they dragged him away, Elian did not struggle. He held his head high, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance. He had sent the signal. He had declared his allegiance. He was a prisoner now, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a navigator, and he had set his course by a new star. Now, he just had to hope his ship was coming. The cell was a perfect cube of white. No windows, no furniture, just a thin mattress on the floor and a slit in the door through which nutrient paste was delivered. The air was scrubbed, sterile, colder than his apartment had been. They had taken his clothes and given him a simple, grey, censor-free tunic. They had cut him off from the world, from all sensory input. It was a sensory deprivation chamber, designed to break the mind through sheer monotony. They thought they were isolating him. They were wrong. They had locked him in a silent room with the most powerful force he had ever known, the memory of Reese's scent. It was his anchor in the white void. He could conjure it at will now, a perfect, vivid recollection. Ozone, earth, pine. He wrapped himself in it like a blanket, a secret defiance in the heart of his prison. He was not alone. They interrogated him, of course, not with violence, but with a far more insidious tool: calm, relentless logic. A team of psychotechnicians, led by Kyle himself, would enter his cell, their faces impassive, their voices monotone. "Explain the anomaly in your behavior, Elian. Detail your contact with the subversive element. Your actions do not compute with your baseline profile. Identify the variable." They treated his transformation as a mathematical problem, a glitch in a program they needed to debug. Elian gave them nothing. He remained silent, his expression serene, his mind focused on the phantom scent, on the amber-eyed man in the medical bay. His silence infuriated them more than any outburst would have. It was illogical. A compliant Omega, by its very nature, should be communicative, eager to please, desperate to be returned to a state of harmony. Elian was a paradox, and the Regency hated paradoxes. Kyle was the most persistent. He would stay after the others had left, standing over Elian, his shadow falling across the small cell. "I do not understand you," he said one time, the words tight with a frustration he could no longer conceal. "Everything was perfect. We were a harmonized unit. I gave you stability. I gave you peace. You gave me a cage, Elian replied, his voice quiet but firm. A beautiful, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. Kale flinched, as if struck. Attachment to the feral is a symptom of your condition. It is not real. It is a chemical delusion. What you and I had, Elian said, looking Kale directly in the eye. That was a chemical delusion. This is biology. It's the truth you've been trying to suppress for 100 years. Kale stared at him, his grey eyes searching for a flicker of doubt, a crack in his resolve. He found none. He turned and left without another word, the sound of the door sealing Elian back into his white silence. Time became meaningless. He measured it in meal deliveries and the silent shift changes of the guards he could sense through the door. He counted the hours, his internal clock ticking steadily toward the timestamp he had sent into the void, 0300. He clung to the hope that his message had been received, that the resistance was moving, planning. It was a fragile, desperate hope, the only thing that kept the crushing weight of the white silence at bay. He thought of Reese, alone in his own prison, being subjected to the repatterning protocol. Had they started it again? Were they slowly, methodically erasing the man he had caught a glimpse of? The thought was a physical pain, a vice tightening around his chest. He sent his own message out into the silence, a focused wave of pure, desperate emotion. Hold on. I am here. Hold on. He didn't know if the connection worked that way, if Reese could feel him as he felt Reese, but he had to try. It was a prayer whispered into the void. The night his internal clock told him was the night of the planned escape. The air in his cell felt different, thicker, charged with an almost electrical tension. Or perhaps it was just his own frantic anticipation. He sat on the thin mattress, his body coiled like a spring, every nerve ending tingling. He had no plan beyond this point. He had given the resistance the key. He could only pray they knew how to use the door. 2:50. 10 minutes. The silence was absolute. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears. 0255. 5 minutes. He closed his eyes, focusing his entire being on the scent. Ozone, pine, earth, freedom. 0259. 1 minute. He held his breath. The world seemed to pause, holding a single, impossibly long moment of silence. 0300. Nothing. The silence stretched, mocking him. A wave of crushing despair washed over him. They hadn't received the message, or they had ignored it. He was alone. He had failed. Reese was lost. He dropped his head into his hands, a dry, racking sob catching in his throat. And then he heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was a deep, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. The floor beneath him trembled. The lights in his cell flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging him into absolute, terrifying darkness. A moment later, the emergency lights kicked in, casting the white cube in a hellish red glow. A siren began to wail, a high, piercing shriek that ripped through the silence. It was happening. They had received his message. Somewhere, deep in the facility, the resistance had created a power surge, targeting the exploit he had identified. For 7 seconds, the containment field around Reese would be down. The sudden, violent chaos was everything Kale's world was designed to prevent. It was beautiful. Elian scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide in the red gloom, his heart a wild drum of terror and elation. The lock on his cell door glowed, then sparked, then went dark. The power surge had overloaded the secondary security systems. He was no longer locked in. He pushed against the heavy door. It didn't budge. He pushed again, with all his strength, his shoulder screaming in protest. It moved just a centimeter, scraping against the floor. It was a manual deadlock, heavy, but not impossible. He had a chance. The tide was turning, and he was going to swim with it. He threw his entire body against the door again and again, the rhythmic, desperate impacts echoing the frantic beat of his own heart. The metal groaned in protest. A gap appeared, wide enough to squeeze his fingers through. He pulled, his muscles straining, the rough edge of the door cutting into his skin. The siren wailed, a soundtrack to his struggle. Red lights pulsed, making the corridor outside flash like a dying nerve. With a final, agonized heave, the door scraped open, just enough for him to slip through. He was out. The corridor was a scene of controlled chaos. Enforcers were running, shouting orders into their comms. Alarms blared from every direction. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt wiring. No one paid him any attention. He was just a ghost in a grey tunic, a piece of debris in the sudden storm. He knew where he had to go. Sub-level 12. He ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor, his movements fueled by pure adrenaline. He was no longer the graceful, placid Omega. He was a creature of instinct, of purpose, of flight. He moved through the chaos, a phantom navigating the collapsing arteries of the machine. He dodged running enforcers, slipped through closing blast doors, and descended level by level, following the mental map he had burned into his memory. As he reached the lift for the sub-levels, he saw him. Kyle. He was standing with a squad of elite enforcers, his face illuminated by the red emergency lights. He looked calm, impossibly calm, a still point in the swirling chaos. He was directing the response, his voice cutting through the din of the alarms. He had not yet seen Elian. Elian froze, pressing himself into the shadows of an alcove. Kale was blocking his path. It was over. He would never reach Reese. Just as despair began to set in, Kale turned and spoke to his second-in-command. The primary breach is on sub-level 12. The asset is loose. Contain him at all costs. I will coordinate the lockdown from the central command. He turned and strode in the opposite direction toward the command center, his form swallowed by the flashing red darkness. The asset. That's what Kale had called him, not Reese. An asset. A thing. The cold fury that filled Elian was a fire in the ice. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Reese. Elian slipped from the shadows and ran for the lift, its doors miraculously still open. He stabbed the button for sub-level 12. The doors slid shut, and the lift began its descent. A metal coffin plunging into the heart of the crisis. The ride was an eternity. When the doors opened, the chaos was even greater. The air was thick with smoke, and the lights were flickering wildly. He could hear the sound of plasma fire, the sharp crackle hiss echoing down the corridor. The resistance was here. They were fighting. He ran toward Medical Bay 3, his lungs burning. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. The corridor was a war zone. Two figures, in dark, non-Regency gear, the Resistance, were pinned down behind an overturned supply cart, exchanging fire with a squad of enforcers. He was trapped. He couldn't get through. Then, from the direction of the medical bay, a new sound emerged. A roar. It was not human. It was a sound of pure, primal rage, a sound that shook the very walls. The enforcers hesitated, their attention diverted. From the smoky doorway of Medical Bay 3, a figure emerged. It was Reese. He was free. The magnetic clamps were gone, the containment suit shredded. He was shirtless, his body a canvas of raw power, his amber eyes glowing with a terrifying fire in the dim light. He held a piece of the broken containment bed in one hand, a jagged length of metal he wielded like a club. He was not the drugged, broken man Elian had seen. He was the storm unleashed. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He fell upon the enforcers not with the calculated precision of a soldier, but with the brutal efficiency of a predator. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. He was his. Reese cleared the corridor in seconds, the remaining enforcers falling back in disarray. He stood panting in the center of the smoky hall, his chest rising and falling, his gaze sweeping the area. Then his eyes found Elian, huddled by the lift. The feral rage in his expression softened, just for a second, replaced by that same shocking recognition. He took a step toward him, and then the world shifted. A single, precise shot from a plasma rifle, fired from the far end of the corridor, struck Reese in the shoulder. He staggered, a cry of pain ripped from his throat, and fell to one knee. At the end of the hall, silhouetted against the flashing lights, stood Kale. He held a plasma rifle, his stance perfect, his aim steady. He had not gone to Central Command. He had known. He had known Elian would come here. "The experiment is over," Kale said, his voice amplified by the corridor's acoustics, impossibly calm. He raised the rifle again, aiming this time for Reese's head. Time slowed. The siren, the smoke, the flashing lights, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing Elian could see was the glowing muzzle of Kale's rifle, and Reese kneeling vulnerable. In that split second, every ounce of conditioning, every lesson in compliance, every scrap of the old Elian burned away. He was not a victim. He was not a pawn. He was a shield. He ran. He threw himself in front of Reese, his slight body a fragile barrier between the man he loved and the man who had owned him. He spread his arms wide, facing Kale, his heart a silent, screaming prayer. "No," he whispered, the sound lost in the din. Kale hesitated. His perfect logic, his calculated precision, had not accounted for this. His target was the feral, the asset. The Omega was a malfunction, a problem to be fixed, but not a target. This was an illogical, inefficient act of self-sacrifice. It did not compute. In that moment of hesitation, Reese moved. With a guttural roar, he surged to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. He grabbed Elian, pulling him behind him with one arm, and with the other he hurled the jagged piece of metal. It flew through the air, a spinning discus of death, and struck Kale square in the chest. Kale staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. The rifle clattered from his hands. He looked down at the metal embedded in his chest, then up at Elian. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a cold, empty confusion. "Inefficient," he breathed, and then he collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut. He was just a man, after all, a broken part of a broken machine. Reese didn't wait. He grabbed Elian's hand, his grip strong and sure, and pulled him down the corridor, away from the fighting, away from Kale's body. Their fingers intertwined. Reese's palm was rough, calloused, and warm. It was the first time they had ever touched. It felt like coming home. "This way," Reese growled, his voice a low rasp. "There's a way out." He led Elian through a maze of service tunnels, his knowledge of the facility's underbelly absolute. The alarms still wailed, but the sounds of fighting grew more distant. They were in the guts of the machine now, a place of pipes and wires and darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dust and oil, and, beneath it all, the glorious, overwhelming scent of Reese. It was the scent of safety, of survival, of him. It filled Elian's lungs, chasing away the last ghosts of the sterile white world, and anchored him in the terrifying, beautiful now. They were running together, hand in hand, into a future that was a complete and utter unknown. And Elian had never felt so certain of anything in his life.